Good afternoon. It's Tuesday, the 31st of January 2017, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Girish. With me in the studio, Mike Robinson. And we are delighted to be joined today by Mark Anderson, truth hound, and he tells me coffee addict. But we'll question him more closely on that in a minute. We've got some pretty appalling weather across the country. Most people reporting moist, grey, damp and unpleasant. But things are hotting up in Trumpton, I believe, Mike. Is that correct?
Yes. Well, as we mentioned yesterday, Donald Trump establishing new vetting measures to keep radical Islamic terrorists out of the United States. We don't want them here, is what he said. So here is the presidential executive order, or is it? Because in fact, this is a presidential executive order, but it's not Trump's. It's Obama's from 2011, and it says presidential proclamation, suspension of entry of aliens subject to United Nations Security Council travel bans and International Emergency Economic Powers Act sanctions. So we've seen all this before. There's nothing new about it. And the key thing is it's not a Muslim ban, although, in fact, the hashtag Muslim ban is being used by just about everyone because it's all about fake news. So Obama has done this kind of thing himself, not just Trump. And let's look at this little video clip and see what this tells us.
All Americans, not only in the states most heavily affected, but in every place in this country, are rightly disturbed by the large numbers of illegal aliens entering our country. The jobs they hold might otherwise be held by citizens or legal immigrants. The public service they use impose burdens on our taxpayers. That's why our administration has moved aggressively to secure our borders more, by hiring a record number of new border guards, by deporting twice as many criminal aliens as ever before, by cracking down on illegal hiring, by barring welfare benefits to illegal aliens. In the budget I will present to you, we will try to do more to speed the deportation of illegal aliens who are arrested for crimes, to better identify illegal aliens in the workplace as recommended by the commission headed by former Congresswoman Barbara Jordan.
So it's all right for Obama and it's all right for Bill Clinton to discuss these issues and pass presidential decrees on these issues, but it's not all right for Trump. So there's a certain amount of hypocrisy there. But here we've got The Guardian saying Saudi Arabia and Egypt are excluded from Trump ban. Why? And they speculate that perhaps it's because Saudi Arabia and Egypt are places where Trump does business. In fact, this absolute fake news agenda item, overtly discussed by The Independent, Muslim majority countries where Donald Trump does business, left untouched by the travel ban. So what is the truth here? Well, it's a 90-day suspension. It's not a ban. It's a suspension of entry for people coming from 7 countries: Iraq, Syria, Iran, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Yemen. And of course, most of those 6 out of those 7 countries are countries where ISIS is active or has been active. And Iran, well, we know that Trump doesn't like Iran too much in any case. But in any case, these countries were not listed in Donald Trump's executive order. That list of countries came from some legislation that was passed in 2016 under Obama. So this more fake news suggesting that this is Trump and his right-wing chicanery. Mark, we can talk about this in a second, but here we have the other piece of fake news being pushed out. In this case, you give me this item from Senator Bennett saying that basically, this is preventing refugees coming into the country and so on, and it's the end of protecting refugees by the United States. Well, what is going on? We've got the lie that it's an absolute ban. We've got the lie that it's the end of refugees coming to the US. It's absolute fake news, but perhaps Foreign Policy magazine gives us a clue. The headline on this is "The Father, the Son, and Donald Trump's Holy War: How Trump's Muslim ban is creating a minority where there was none before, making all Americans choose where they stand." So, this perhaps gives us a clue. We're creating a minority, and this is something that I know you've hinted at several times in the past, Brian. That the Muslim community was to become the new Jews in the sense of the Second World War, and it is amusing, if I'm being slightly ironic in the use of that word, that when you look at the protesters in the UK over this travel ban by Trump, that many of the placards that are being displayed are using words like appeasement and invoking the Second World War, implying that Trump is a Hitler-like figure. Now, if we look at what's going on in the UK here, this is the petition. It's a couple of days old now. Prevent Donald Trump from making a state visit to the United Kingdom because, according to the mainstream media, we're going to embarrass the Queen if Donald Trump comes here, right? So almost 1.7 million signatures on this by now. When I took this screenshot, it was 1.648, but it's going up at a huge rate of knots. And 1.648 million signatures then. But if we actually look at who is signing, or at least the distribution of signatures around the country, the darker colours on this map of the UK are where the majority of where more signatures are coming from. And we find that it's from some constituencies in central London. It's from Oxford and Cambridge in particular. Those are the three main hotspots: Oxford, Cambridge, and central London. And what I found fascinating about this is that it's not Muslim areas, places where Muslim communities are traditionally residing. So I found that a fascinating thing. But a new petition has gone up. It's a day old now, saying that Donald Trump should make a state visit to the United Kingdom. So far, that has got 91,000 or 92,000 signatures. But actually, if we look at the rates of the numbers of signatures per hour at present, they're not so different. So at the moment, there are 8,500 people signing the Prevent Donald Trump petition per hour, and there are almost 7,000 people per hour signing the Donald Trump should make a state visit to the United Kingdom. And Brian, Mark, what this says to me is that the agenda here, Brian, if we start with you, the agenda here is division, purely division, because Obama and Clinton before have used similar language. They've done similar things. What's the difference? The difference is the media is producing fake news stories to drive public opinion.
I think it's just obvious, Mike, to the extent it is getting difficult to know what else we have to put out as a media source, UK column, in order to show people what's happening. But everything is division. So you started off saying, well, we could see division being created in the United States. And then you look at what that petition is doing and the counter petition in Britain, that is dividing people, polarizing people. And all of a sudden, it's as though the liberals in America and the liberals, using that term very loosely in UK, are the ones protecting the Muslims. But where were they when Libya was being bombed to pieces, Syria was being bombed to pieces, Yemen still being bombed to pieces, or Iraq? Where were the petitions to protect the Muslims? So these things are driven. I would imagine that if you've got centres like Cambridge and Oxford on the map, this is money coming in, possibly even British government money through the Department for International Development itself, or the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Soros must be in there somewhere, but this is about getting people at each other's throats, because while people are busy squabbling over the so-called Muslim threat, and no doubt there'll be a bit of reaction to that comment, but I'll add more in a minute. While they're squabbling amongst each other, the government can drive through whatever policy it wants. And before we hand over to you, Mark, I'll just say I'm going to be talking about the BBC specifically a little bit later in the news. But the BBC as a media source so dangerous to homeland America, I don't think many people in America realise just how dangerous the BBC is in its reporting on American affairs.
Mark, what are your comments on this?
Covering the Senate floor yesterday, Senator Tom Cotton, an Arkansas senator, he mentioned, and this goes hand in hand with what you were saying, guys. He said it's not a ban, it's a 3 to 4 month pause temporarily from countries with very weak constitutions or who sponsor terrorism. Now, that was Cotton's take on this, not my opinion. I'm speaking strictly of what was said. And he went on to say, post Obama, that a temporary pause for security reviews is sensible, as according to Cotton, it was also sensible for France around the time of the attacks on France. But he added, Senator Cotton added, where were the tears when Obama overthrew Libya and then didn't follow through there? And then other senators, such as Senator Dick Durbin out of Illinois, went on to make a weird mixture of statements. He added, quote, overwhelmingly, these Syrian refugees are victims of years-long war, escaping the deadly war of terrorists who've ravaged that country. And this is emblematic of what many on the Senate floor said. And the confusion stems from largely the media. And Republicans and Democrats are both speaking as if everything that's happened to Syria has nothing to do with what the U.S. military has done to Syria. So they keep talking about Assad is the devil and he's the bad guy and all these different things. But there's such hubris in the American look at itself, in its view of itself, in its foreign policy. This idea that America can do no wrong, the idea that the American military is just vacuumed clean of any sins. And so everything is somebody else's fault. They can't grasp and they will not say explicitly, and this is because of media distortion largely, they will not say that Syrian refugees and other refugees are leaving their home countries to go to Europe and in some cases to try to get to America because of Western wars on these Middle Eastern nations. This is the fact, and the fact that Aleppo has been largely liberated. These facts, covered up by the mainstream media, just do not percolate to the top. Then, therefore, the lawmakers will not state these facts. They will not base their policies on these facts. And so everything becomes this getting at each other's throats thing that you guys are talking about, this constant squabbling. And the root of it, the taproot, is that the media won't tell the truth, and these senators won't acknowledge it anyway. They won't acknowledge the Western complicity in destroying these nations and creating these mass migrations in the first place. They just won't admit it. They just won't acknowledge the truth.
Mark, I'll come straight back in there if I may, because earlier this morning I spoke to the BBC press office. I was speaking about their reality check team, more on that in a minute. But at one point I said to the lady, well, of course, the BBC itself is not telling the truth. And she said in a very surprised voice, oh, really? Where? And I said, well, they haven't told the truth over Syria. They didn't tell the truth over Libya. They're not telling the truth over Yemen. And she then said to me, well, what in Syria? So I said, well, are you aware that the BBC itself had assets on the ground working to help stir up dissent against Assad? I said to her, did you know that was happening? And she said, no. And I said, well, go away and check it. So we've got a really dangerous situation where I'm going to stick with the BBC because BBC seems to have still this gloss of truth over it, which many of the commercial American stations don't. So the BBC getting into countries like Syria and very subtly helping to get the friction going, get the young against the old, get people who are non-religious against the religious people. We even had the BBC trying to encourage women in Iran not to wear the hijab, if that's the headscarf, if that's the right word, and saying, well, of course, if they don't wear it, they may risk imprisonment or even torture. But the BBC actively promoting it because this helps destabilize the countries. So it's not just American muscle that's doing this. This is a Western conspiracy where we're using media for the soft power, and then we're also using the military. And of course, we always call on the Americans because effectively Britain is in a very weak position from a military sense at the moment.
That's an excellent point. It's pressure from below and pressure from above. Soft power on the bottom, the hard power, the military power on top. Kind of a pincher strategy, if I understand it right, Brian.
Yes,
And
exactly.
indeed, you have Senator Merkley out of Oregon also speaking on the Senate floor yesterday, going on to say, partially based on his own misperceptions and on media lies, on fake media, going on to say that Trump's ban, whatever its minutia, whatever its fine points, good or bad, is an effort, an effort against freedom of worship itself, as if that as if the temporary ban on this travel, whatever its good or bad points, as if it's an attack on religion itself, uh, because of this observation that Trump is saying Syrian Christians would get a pass, but Syrian Muslims wouldn't. But then Merkley goes on to say a number of things. I'm looking at my notes here. Uh, this gives here's what he said. This gives our enemies the false narrative that the U.S. is at war with Islam, Senator Merkley said, putting our nation at risk. So get this, they're trying to say that only now that Trump has initiated this ban, only now could those that practice Islam get the impression that the U.S. is at war with them. Oh, let me see. Wouldn't bombs dropping 5, 6, 7 years ago on Islamic countries, wouldn't that give them the impression that the U.S. is at war with them? Oh, I see. That doesn't do it. It's only now that Trump instituted this ban. Only now our enemies are getting the impression that the U.S. is at war with Islam. The bombs didn't do it. It's just Trump's policy on the travel ban. So these are the kind of just absurd statements that could only come, at least largely come, from the distorted media narrative that we keep getting. And so on and so forth. I mean, I could go on quoting these things, but these are samples of the bizarre statements coming off the Senate floor that don't even really get to the heart of the how and the why of Trump's policy so much as they're just emotionally divisive statements that just distort the whole matter. And this stems, as I say, largely from the media just stirring the pot. And when you talk about the BBC actually getting involved in the day-to-day life of these ladies and their lifestyle and what they wear in terms of their attire, that's just crazy. I mean, that's outright subversion.
That is the word.
Well, that's the word, and we have an article which has now been up on the UK Column website for 2 years, I think it is, which is called BBC Media Action Subversion from Broadcasting House to Kazakhstan. But I've got a little more on this subject to come up in this news today.
Mark, you're writing a book on the weaponization of the media. I think the first time you mentioned that to me was 4 or 5 months ago. In that 4 or 5 months, could you have imagined the degree to which the mainstream media has been weaponized and how that's being deployed at the moment?
No, I could not have, which is why when I produce the hard copy, I'm going to have an online version that actually has new chapters added while others are subtracted. It's going to be kind of a living book, if you will, because this is an ongoing problem, the likes of which we can scarcely imagine. We have things like Robo-News, where robots are being trained to write basic economic forecast stories, probably weather, things like that. And you can almost understand it from a certain standpoint, but the problem is where will that go in terms of having machines write news? Will they get into foreign policy? Will they get into things besides sports and weather and financial forecasts? And you even have things like that. But you have these things by the BBC that you guys are describing, and you have this ongoing, unexpected places where the media plies its dirty trade. And of course, there's overlooked issues like when it comes to pro-life and abortion issues and the weaponization of language, which I've written about on my blog from time to time. It just runs the whole gamut of either things coming up that we didn't expect or things that have been going a long time, but we overlooked them. We didn't realize that the involvement of the media or the depth and breadth of its duplicity. So Yes, you're absolutely right, Mike. It's something that we're really just getting a big look at. We're finally getting a look at the whole, panorama of it. But new things keep coming up all the time that surprise even us, and we, look at these things every day.
Well, I'll just add into that we were recently given a pointer by one of our viewers towards recently released CIA paperwork, which included letters where a department of the CIA, the FBIS, was praising the staff of BBC Monitoring for their help on that particular occasion for providing help around the Iran hostage rescue incident. But of course, this is only a tiny glimpse of what was really going on, because of course the BBC was really set up as a propaganda machine and based in America during the Second World War. And what we're now seeing is a very, very cosy relationship, not only between the BBC and British intelligence services, that's gone on for years, and the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office, but we're now seeing the strength of those links back into the CIA. So you have this very, very dirty and dangerous link that the BBC is working with the very intelligence services who have clearly been helping to stir up some of this angst and wars, violence on the ground, and then they casually report it as if they've got clean hands. So I think we're seeing some absolutely vile stuff emerge. And yes, we've been very happy to say what the BBC is actually doing, which is to destabilize a nation state. The correct word is subversion.
Yes. Right. Let's move on then. Mark, you wanted to highlight this article on the Iran nuclear deal. Is it dead or alive? This is by Pat Buchanan.
Well, Pat Buchanan is saying that he hopes it's not dead. Trump's stated position on it is that he's going to give it a thorough review, and he's even told his more hawkish colleagues or allies in the government, especially in the House and Senate, that he's intent on redoing it. Some are wondering whether this is bluster. This article by Pat Buchanan can be read at AmericanFreePress.net. I encourage listeners and viewers to go ahead and check it out for details. But what it basically is saying is that there's a lot of good things about the Iran deal. It is people argue, one of the few relatively good things that came from the pen of President Obama. But of course, other nations are involved in this, not just the United States. So just like the TPP that Trump pulled the U.S. out of, Trump could pull our approval, I suppose, out of the Iran deal, but other countries were involved in brokering this. And basically, the question will become, once Trump gets his cabinet seated and gets through some of these other thorny issues, will the Iran deal survive as is, or will it, as Trump seemed to promise or seemed to claim, will it be rewritten or even torn up? You do have Iran being one of the countries from which travel is being banned right now under executive order. I think it's 137. And by the way, there's legislation on the Senate floor right now, Senate Resolution 240 by California Senator Dianne Feinstein, to try and rescind Executive Order 137 on the travel ban. That came up yesterday on January 30th on the Senate floor. We'll see what happens with Senate Resolution 240. But Iran is part of the ban. This stems from apparently Trump's belief, however well suited that belief is, however well founded or not that belief is, that Iran is a sponsor of terrorism. And this is an oft repeated thing. It's often said that Iran is this pervasive sponsor of terrorism, but I don't remember Iran ever claiming responsibility for blowing up a cafe or blowing up cars or something, or committing an outright explicit physical terrorist attack, certainly not in recent memory. Whatever might have Iran's fingerprints on it terrorist-wise, it certainly isn't obvious stuff, and it certainly isn't widely or frequently publicized stuff. You don't really see hard proof that Iran is this ongoing sponsor of terrorism, at least not in an obvious, explicit way. I certainly would like to see more proof of that. Iran, I believe, largely instituted a pretty good nuclear ban, and Pat Buchanan writes about it pretty clearly here. So it's just based on, is Trump trying to appease his hawkish allies in the government, or is Trump actually intent on tearing up that nuclear weapons ban? Apart from the fact that Iran having one nuclear weapon, which it does not have, hardly would constitute a threat in a world where Israel has unofficially 400 nuclear weapons, and the U.S. and the Russians have thousands. So Iran having one weapon anyway would be largely not threatening and not very meaningful. So we'll see how the issue plays out. But Pat Buchanan lays out the parameters really well. That overall it's a pretty good deal, and he hopes that Trump does not scuttle it.
Okay, well, look, just before we leave the subject of Trump, just briefly, Mark, where is it with the confirmations of his team? There are still a few jobs to be filled, is that right?
Yes, it's a moving target. The main ones approved are Kelly for Homeland Security and Mad Dog. Boy, the names escape me sometimes. There's
Mattis.
Mad Dog Mattis, for Secretary of Defense. Tillerson, the vote was yesterday, but Senator Chuck Schumer, among others, arguing against the travel ban, supporting Senate Resolution 240. They slowed down the machinery on Tillerson's approval. They did invoke cloture, which means they ended the debate on Tillerson for the time being, but now they cast a separate vote late yesterday on January 30th to take up the Tillerson final confirmation, probably today, January 31st, maybe starting tomorrow, but probably today, allowing 30 hours of debate. They're saying now things are shifting around in a very strange way, but so Tillerson is next, and Jeff Sessions for Attorney General would be after that. But they're behind in the overall approval process. They did approve Nikki Haley, the former South Carolina governor, to be our UN ambassador. So they've got 3 or 4 down, but several to go. That's where they're at.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Let's run through a couple of ads. Just a reminder that the next UK Column Northern Exposure meeting is happening on Sunday, the 5th of February. 2 to 5 p.m. at Cathedral View Room, Brayport Centre, Dunblane. So hopefully as many people as possible can get along to that. Ian Crane pointed me out to there being a lock-on at the Preston New Road anti-fracking protection camp. Head over to Ian Crane's Facebook page if you want to see some kind of live coverage of that. But clearly the first of the 2017 fracking protests starting to get interesting.
Yeah, provoked, I think, is what's actually happening there, Mike.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's move on. We're heading in the direction of the BBC, but we've been talking Iran, and this popped up on my screen this morning. This is an old UK column report from back at the beginning of last year, but somebody kindly had sent in a video saying, have a look at this, because it's a video talking about Iran and the BBC's role in the coup of 1973. So people might like to have a look at that. But also we can say, if you go onto the UK column site, just put in BBC Media Action, and you can see some of the articles that we've written exposing what's really been going on. Now, we really like it when we get interesting emails, and this one came in this morning. Hi, Brian. Just picked this up from BBC Media Action website. Initially, I saw this as a waste of someone's money, whoever backs Media Action. Then I decided to read the blurb and found something so hypocritical you might want to sit down before you read it. And what he found is it's saying that basically since launching in 2012, with our partners BBC Arabic and the Palestinian Broadcasting Corporation, we've reached 1.17 million adults in Gaza and the West Bank, helping people understand their rights and hold public officials to account. So there's the BBC crowing that they're in amongst the media in a very big way in Gaza. And what is the BBC doing? It's holding officials to account. Well, if you analyse what that really means, is that they are stirring up people, so that basically people are then acting against each other.
And we should maybe give a health warning for the next one.
Well, this is true. So here's the BBC. It's going into a population and say, we, the BBC, will help you challenge your public officials, the very thing which the BBC doesn't do in UK. And this is the other technique of the BBC, is that they are going into these nation states, predominantly Muslim countries, throwing what they seem to think is prime Western culture into the countries. Now, I've chosen a very mild image here. Mike is wincing slightly by the side of me, but this is one of the milder images of Madonna at work. BBC thinks that this pop culture is the culture to be pushing into Muslim countries for the good of their society. And I'm going to say, Mark, this is so obvious now. There's no pretense that the BBC might not be doing it, because BBC's own material boasts that they're getting into Middle Eastern countries, predominantly Muslim countries. They are helping youngsters set up social sites, social media, talking about current issues, important issues like I've forgotten the word, but basically promoting all forms of sexuality. The word will come back to me in a moment. So the BBC gets in there, it promotes the pop culture, it promotes highly sexualized behavior, particularly by young people. This is soft power in our faces. I don't know whether you have sort of picked up on this in the States, but the evidence here in UK is overwhelming.
Certainly, it is another form of soft power, cultural warfare, informational warfare. To show a highly sexualized woman, some people even say tranny, like Madonna, is people don't realize what they're getting at when they do this, and it's something that runs very deep. It's the same reason that the Israelis, after they overthrew Palestine back in the late 40s, they and in the subsequent time in the late 40s, early 50s, they beamed pornography into the homes of those they conquered. And the idea was to overthrow the basic family fabric, to get the man over, the male of the household overly sexualized. It tends to pull apart at the seams of family integrity. This isn't just saying, we got a cooler culture than yours, and hey, we're all liberated, and you're too stuffy wearing your burqas and all these things. This is something much broader and much deeper, to separate sex from procreation. It goes a long ways to undermine the whole idea of giving birth to new children, and to growing larger families. And to sexualize the male, and to make the home country look like it's backward. This is not to say that everything about the Middle Eastern culture is sterling and ours is just completely, decadent. But it has a long-range meaning, and it's part of the pornography culture. It's part of undermining the birth rate, and undermining the very idea of what a family is and how families grow and become the bedrock of society. It really is that in depth. It really is that important. People just don't realize. They just see the surface appeal and they don't think any further. But it's a very deep cultural subversion. E. Michael Jones, the noted writer that I know from South Bend, Indiana, he's written on this. He can explain it very well, among others.
Excellent analysis, Mark. I was distracted for a fraction there with the next slide, because brace yourself, here we are, the BBC now in charge of reality. Well, the BBC has said it's now the guardian, effectively, of truth across the World Wide Web. So I've now been going on their webpage, the Reality Check webpage. What I found this morning was article after article, which is simply the BBC giving credibility to Conservative government political agenda. Here was their attack on Corbyn, leader of the Labour Party. And let's have a look at the sort of thing they were going for. The claim down here, levels of inequality in the UK have been getting worse. That's what Mr. Corbyn said. And the BBC says with its reality check, official figures suggest that income distribution has become less unequal over the past decade. So let's get that in big language so we can all read it. So this is the BBC pushing in its version of the truth. It's rather convoluted language, Mike, isn't it? Official figures suggest that income distribution has become less unequal over the past.
So the reality check is not. There is no reality check.
Well,
Suggestions.
It's suggestions. We can demonstrate that. Let's have a look at the article. And the first thing I notice, of course, is it's anonymous. So we're told that the BBC has set up a reality check team. We know it's headed by a man who had to apologise from the Leveson inquiry. I phoned the BBC media team this morning. As I said, I tried to find out who had written this article. They didn't know, and they didn't see why I should want to know.
So they're so enthusiastic and so keen to push forward their reality check, but nobody's prepared to stand up and say, I've produced this.
Indeed, and I did say to the girl, was it produced by a computer? She thought I was taking the mickey. I was joking with her, but of course you've actually had, you, Mike, have had on UK Column the article talking about computer-generated news across the world.
Mark mentioned it a couple of minutes ago, yes.
Indeed. So let's see what they say. So first of all, it's an anonymous article, and the BBC didn't want to tell us any more about that this morning. They then used the government's own statistics of proof. So we haven't got time to call those up on screen, but go and have a look at the article yourself. They then say, with respect to those figures, there are caveats around them. They're based on surveys. So there is a margin of error, and that is particularly difficult to get survey responses from people at the top end of the income distribution. Okay, so remember what they said initially. And then from 2006 to 14, there was a small increase in overall wealth inequality, with property wealth having the biggest effect. So they've denied it's happening, but in their own article, there's proof it is happening.
Yeah.
And so we go on. Department for Work and Pension figures include housing cost, because some of these figures don't. So they say DWP figures include housing costs. The difference it makes is that inequality increases 2013 to 14, although it's still below pre-financial crisis levels. So again, they give evidence supporting it. None of this suggests that inequality does not exist in the UK, or that it's not a problem, or indeed it's not worse than in other countries. But there is little evidence that it's been getting worse in the UK in the past decade. But they've just given that evidence.
This is screwing with minds.
Yes.
In an unbelievably devious way.
This is not just propaganda. This is attacking it's creating cognitive dissonance in people. You read the headline, then you read the article yourself, and it is playing with your head. So if we come back to those claims, and we put in just one bit of evidence that's in the body of the article, there it is. And what is the BBC doing? Spinning facts and distorting truth. This is utterly despicable stuff, Mark, and I wish we could get some of this in front of the millions of US viewers who are still mistaken enough to think that the BBC tells the truth.
There is kind of a general. There is kind of a general impression that the BBC is pretty truthful, pretty straight ahead. Not among everyone, of course, but among a lot of people. That's the kind of issue where you need a lot more information, and you need some very clear parameters on what you're talking about. The bottom line is always that due to the usury in the system, ultimately the interest charges, as all money is created as debt, the interest charges ultimately overcome the flow of money into the economy. So it becomes what's known as interest drain. And other factors play a role, of course. The system is non-self-liquidating. You never create enough income, and the production costs always pile up, and the prices pile up, and the debts pile up, always beyond what the money supply is. So there's always a general inequality because we don't have the purchasing power to balance production and consumption. Usury takes money out at a brisk rate. The money to pay the interest is never created. And ultimately, we lose more money than we gain in a debt-based money system. And so yeah, there's inequality in that macro sense, but these microeconomics that the BBC is talking about, they're very imprecise, and as you guys pointed out very ably, they contradict their own narrative.
Yeah,
So,
and Mark, you've just given some proper analysis of what we should be talking about around inequalities. The BBC doesn't do that. Very quickly, let me just show you this. I found this on that very Reality Check webpage. It's a very sad-looking little chimpanzee. And what do I discover from this? I discover that the BBC is boasting that it's just finished a year-long investigation into the trafficking and abuse of baby chimpanzees. And it says here, the baby chimp ripped away from his family in the wild is the victim of a lucrative and brutal smuggling operation exposed by a 12-month-long BBC News investigation. Now, I've got a lot of time for animals and, of course, chimpanzees, very attractive animals to most people. But we have got no BBC investigation, and certainly not a year-long investigation into the trafficking of children for abuse, torture and murder. So we've got this stunning hypocrisy. This is the man who put the article together. Now, I think this man's heart's in the right place. David Shukman from the BBC, he's done a lot of good work on animals. Where is the good work from the BBC over the trafficking and abuse of children? Well, of course, they haven't done it.
And it's interesting that BBC investigation was done alongside Interpol. Interpol in the last couple of weeks released a news story where they said that they had identified 100,000 children who'd from child pornography images and whatnot. I wrote to Interpol and said, you identified those 100,000 children, how many convictions came out of that? And they said, we don't hold that data. So that information, the BBC investigation into the trafficking of chimpanzees, if listening to the radio discussion of it this morning, has resulted in more tangible results in prosecutions and so on than a similar investigation by Interpol into child trafficking and child abuse and child sexualization.
Yeah.
So we see where the priorities are for both the BBC and for Interpol, in fact.
Indeed. Same BBC now controlling the truth. Somebody suggested that there was a truth ministry being set up. I'm going to say it's already here. It's called the BBC.
Yes. Now, we're running out of time. So just briefly, Department for International Development, UK to boost jobs and trade for the world's poorest countries. Apparently, we're going to invest in economic development with the help of, which will help developing nations speed up their rate of economic growth. This is fantastic. We're going to spend over the next decade, 1 billion more young people will enter the job market, mainly in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa. So we're going to help with that. What are we going to do? We're going to build the potential for developing countries to trade more with the UK. So we want more trade. We're going to create economic opportunities in fragile and conflict areas where jobs and livelihoods are desperately needed. We're going to build partnerships with business, including small and medium-sized enterprises, to make it easier for companies, including those in the UK, to invest in markets of the future. That's good. Here's the one. Here's the kicker. We're going to work closely, this is the British government that is going to work closely with the City of London as it becomes the leading financial centre for the developing world. So, in fact, what we're actually going to do is we're going to rape and pillage, as we always have in the developing world. And it's all going to be about finance and not production and so on.
Driven by soft power in the first instance, and if that doesn't work, then you bring in the heavies, basically.
Absolutely. So what did Priti Patel have to say about this? She's the International Development Secretary. She said developing countries want to harness trade, growth and investment opportunities, and Britain will lead the way to lift huge numbers out of grinding poverty to prosperity.
Excuse me, Mike, that can't be true because well, there's no inequality according to the BBC.
Yes. Okay. So let's just end with Brexit then, because of course the big fight has begun, and the European Union notification of withdrawal bill is in its second reading in the House of Commons today, and apparently there's going to be a whole swathe of amendments to this bill. Now let's just remember the entirety of this bill is 6, 10, 12, 14 lines of text. So that is the entirety of the bill. So I'm not quite sure what they're going to amend in that bill.
I think they'll be adding,
Right.
and then
Okay.
you can debate what's added. That'll
Well,
be the way it works.
Okay, but anyway, it's the charade, the Circus Act is beginning. Apparently, they're going to be debating this from today until I think the 8th of February or so. So plenty of time for them to discuss. 14 lines of text, lots to discuss in that bill, and undoubtedly at the end we will have a firm timetable for when Brexit's going to happen
A firm
or not.
plan to leave,
Yeah,
or not.
indeed.
Mark, we'll just give you 30 seconds closing remarks on anything that you'd like.
Yeah, when
Within
Theresa
reason.
May,
Within
when
reason.
Theresa May, Austria's prime minister, when she addressed the GOP retreat in Philadelphia last Thursday, she said, the new global Britain, she kept saying that, will become even more global and more internationalist in both action and spirit. And I'm delighted that the new Trump administration has made a trade agreement between our two countries one of its earliest priorities. And so this new global Britain, she spoke of it in such a way where you got the clear impression, and really she made it quite clear that Britain is going to be so global that whether it's in or out of the EU will make very little difference in terms of day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month operations. You just plug the US into Britain, plug Britain into its ongoing trade with the EU, which is going to keep going all the same, pretty much the same, and you have largely the same enchilada with just slightly different ingredients and arrangements. So her words to the GOP in their annual retreat in Philadelphia were quite revealing in terms of Britain staying the course in this global mindset, this global construct.
Yep, brilliant. Thank you,
Okay.
Mark.
Great summary. Well, we'll end on the note. We were going to cover an MP, David Morris, from Morecambe area. We will do that in the news tomorrow. He has this to say: as you will no doubt understand, it's inappropriate for me to comment on an individual case and imperative that we respect the independence of the judiciary and respect the judgment of the court. So there we are, an MP bigging up the courts because they're doing such a good job. Whether or not anybody appears in person, we'll be reporting on David Morris tomorrow. And what is that about? It's about the continued incarceration of Melanie Shaw. That's it for today. Thank you for joining us. We will be back at the same time tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.